Brazil is the country with the largest number of Portuguese speakers in the world, but the situation could have been completely different today. Although the Portuguese declared their colonial ambitions early on, they encountered a powerful rival: the Dutch. The Dutch were also considered a highly skilled naval power, eager to claim more land in the New World. As a result, the Dutch gradually took control of increasingly large parts of Brazil. This led to a true race for the land around the Amazon, culminating in a final showdown. But why did the Dutch come to Brazil in the first place, and how did the Portuguese manage to prevail and create one of the largest colonies in the world? All of these questions are what we will explore in today's video. Enjoy! The arrival of the Dutch was largely facilitated by the Spaniards. Until the 16th century, the Netherlands itself was a part of the Spanish Habsburg Empire. This early connection with overseas colonies helped the Dutch develop into a formidable naval power. In secret, the Seven Provinces, as the Netherlands was often called at the time, had already begun preparing for separation from the motherland. This led to a war that would last a total of 80 years, in which they would finally win their independence. Even during the war, the Dutch began asserting their colonial interests, seeking to establish themselves as one of the European great powers. A key milestone was the founding of the Dutch West India Company. This trading company was granted an exclusive monopoly by Amsterdam for trade in West Africa and the Americas, and later also in Asia. The system worked as follows. The West India Company set up trading posts in the New World, gradually bought more land, and the Dutch government later placed these under its protection, turning them into colonies. This system was highly successful. Colonies were established not only in countries like Ghana, Sri Lanka, or New Amsterdam, modern-day New York, but the Dutch also increasingly set their sights on South America, which at the time was ruled exclusively by the Spanish and Portuguese. Thus, in 1621, the West India Company arrived in Brazil. While initially organizing raids on existing Portuguese trading posts, they eventually began seizing land. The northern part of Brazil, known for its lucrative sugar production, especially caught their attention. It's important to remember that during this time, the Dutch were still embroiled in the 80 Years' War with Spain, and controlling Brazilian sugar promised not only financial gains for the company, but also the potential to strengthen the Netherlands' position in the war. So, they acted very aggressively in Brazil. While the West India Company had already seized some coastal strips in the north, the Dutch government sent more and more troops to South America. They had one main objective: the capture of the capital of Portuguese Brazil, Salvador da Bahia. An expeditionary army of 26 ships, 450 cannons, and 3,300 men landed on the coast, a few miles from the capital. Within hours, the entire city was surrounded, and the Portuguese governor surrendered. The city was now in Dutch hands. However, the conquest was short-lived. Just a year later, the Portuguese arrived with a much larger fleet off the coast of Salvador and forced the Dutch to surrender. A long battle for dominance in Brazil had begun, the so-called Dutch-Portuguese War. The Dutch, however, were just getting started. Shortly afterward, they sent one of their most capable admirals to the New World, Hendrik Lonck. He had already proven himself in numerous battles against the Spanish and was now tasked with demonstrating his skills in the New World. He landed with an expeditionary army of 67 ships, over 1,000 cannons, and 7,000 men off the coast of Brazil. This time, however, the target was not Salvador, but the more northern regions, especially Pernambuco, which at the time was the largest and richest sugar-producing region in the world. Interest was high, and this time the expedition was successful. The entire province of Pernambuco was captured relatively quickly. These conquests were funded by regular raids on the Spanish Silver Fleet. Twice a year, the Spanish undertook massive transport missions to ship all the resources from the New World back to the homeland. There was no greater prize than capturing some of these ships. For a long time, the men of the West India Company essentially acted as state-sponsored pirates, and with these riches, the colony of New Holland continued to grow. In 1636, Johann Moritz, Prince of Nassau-Siegen, was appointed Governor-General of Dutch Brazil. He founded Mauritsstad, the modern city of Recife, as the capital of his domain. From there, sugar was transported back to the Netherlands, and the city also served as a base for further conquests. The Dutch were far from satisfied. They also seized other regions of South America, such as modern-day Guyana and Suriname, the latter remaining a Dutch colony until the late 20th century. Further south, around the cities of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, raids continued, but these cities were too well defended by the Portuguese. By 1650, the map of South America looked something like this. Spain had spread across almost the entire western coast of the continent, while the eastern coast was divided between the Portuguese and the Dutch. But it was clear to both powers that only one of them could maintain permanent colonial rule on the eastern coast. Both sides prepared for a final war. As we can see, the Portuguese quickly expanded toward the Amazon to prevent the Dutch from advancing further and to stop the northern and southern colonies from uniting. The Portuguese also began launching their own raids on enemy territories. But the Dutch were not idle. At one point, they managed to establish a naval blockade around Lisbon, cutting the motherland off from its colonies. In Brazil, more and more settlers chose to live on Dutch-controlled land rather than Portuguese-controlled land. The Dutch were known early on for their liberal policies, offering religious freedom and property security. But they had also made new enemies, the British. As mutual raids increased, their fleets clashed more often, leading to the First Anglo-Dutch War, which England won, significantly weakening the Dutch. At the same time, the Portuguese secured a decisive victory in Angola, where the Dutch had recruited much of their slave labor. Without African slaves, New Holland couldn't survive for long. The Portuguese now pulled out all the stops to drive the Dutch out of Brazil once and for all. They armed Portuguese citizens who had previously defected to the enemy in large numbers, dissatisfied with the weakened Dutch, who could no longer adequately supply them. Without slaves from Angola, the colony was on the brink of collapse. A full-scale revolt broke out across Pernambuco, and the Dutch gradually lost control. Eventually, all remaining Dutch forces gathered in the capital, Recife, for a final battle. Fierce fighting raged for several days, but the Portuguese finally broke into the city, and the remaining Dutch were expelled from Brazil. New Holland was history, and in the subsequent peace treaty, the Dutch relinquished all of Brazil to the Portuguese. In return, Portugal agreed to pay 8 million Dutch guilders as compensation and recognized Dutch control over some territories in Asia. In the meantime, the West India Company had already ventured into new regions and was increasingly transforming into the East India Company. Former Portuguese colonies like Ceylon, today's Sri Lanka, gradually fell into Dutch hands. In Southeast Asia, particularly in modern-day Indonesia, they also expanded further. But even there, a new Dutch-Portuguese war would soon break out. Brazil, however, was now completely under Portuguese control. Over the next decades, the Portuguese would consolidate power over the entire country. This is how Portuguese became a global language and is now the mother tongue of nearly 200 million Brazilians. But what remains of the Dutch in Brazil today, especially in Recife, Dutch buildings and streets can still be found. And while Portuguese is the dominant language in Brazil, there are a few Dutch words and expressions that have made their way into Brazilian colloquial speech. It's estimated that today around 1 million Brazilians are descendants of the Dutch, and in some major cities in the north, there are entire Dutch neighborhoods.